So far, we've been learning what rhetoric means. We've learned how to think rhetorically, and we've also learned about the rhetorical situation. In freshman composition, we also want students to learn how to read rhetorically. And in order to do that, we want to go back to some basics regarding study skills. And these would be reading basics. So, for instance, look at your textbook and let's consider the title. Everyone's an author with readings. Now, can you maybe hypothesize what the book is about? Well, if you guessed that the book wants you to learn that everybody can be an author regarding what modality it is, then you guessed right. Let's look at the next step regarding reading rhetoric. You would also want to consider who the editors and authors are. So if you look at the bottom of your textbook, you will see all of those names for you. Let's go to the next step. This would involve looking at the title page. And if you look at the title page, you will see those names that were on the front of the book, but you will also see who the publisher is and where their locations are. Now, if you were going to create a citation for this book or an essay within this book, you would quote whichever city is closest to you. Now, for those of us in Tulsa, Oklahoma, of course, New York would be the closest. Let's move on to the next step in rhetorical reading. We would want to consider whether or not the book that you're reading is current. So if we turn the page, we will see that this book was originally written in 2013 and it has also been copyrighted in 2017. So this book is current. Therefore, we can say that we can rely on it. It would be a credible source. Most students skip over a preface within a book, but the preface provides you with useful information. It lets you know the purpose of the book. It lets you know who has contributed to the book, and it also lets you know what the editors and authors hope that a person will take away from a book. So always read your prefaces. It will provide you with useful information. After reading a preface, you want to go to the table of contents. And when you get to the table of contents, it would be useful to think in terms of blocks of information. For your textbook, if you will look, you will see that you have these highlighted bold headings. So part 1, the need for rhetoric and writing. And if we scroll down, part 2, writing processes. Part 3, genres of writing. Part 4, the centrality of argument. And part 5, research. Then let's scroll back up and then look at the bold headings within each section of the book within the table of contents. So if we look at part 1, we know that we are going to think rhetorically, learn about the rhetorical situation, read rhetorically, discuss the demands of academic argument, writing and rhetoric as a field of study, and writing and rhetoric in the workplace. Then you could go back, and for each one of these chapters, you could look to see the bold headings within each of these sections. So if you follow these steps for each part of the table of contents, you would become well aware of what the authors are going to discuss. After you have read the table of contents, you would then follow basic reading study skills within each chapter. So let's look at those as well. Within the table of contents, I can better show you the layout for chapter 3, which is what we're discussing right now. So if we look, we see reading rhetorically. That is the chapter that we're discussing presently. And then within that chapter, there are main ideas that the editors and authors want you to take away from the reading. To understand and engage with reading, to read across any modality, whether it be a typed book, whether it be information on the internet, whether it be a speech, whatever it may be, they want you to make sure that you can go across media, as well as genres. And they want you to make sure what is expected from you within the academic disciplines. Now that I've used the table of contents to highlight for you what Chapter 3 is all about, I want to further demonstrate how you can read rhetorically by looking at Chapter 3. So let's turn to page 25 within your textbook. So again, when you're reading rhetorically, you want to look at bold headings and you want to consider how the essay is organized. The next step that you would do is you would read the first and last sentence of every paragraph. And you would also want to read the introduction and the conclusion. So let's take a look. Reading rhetorically. Chances are you read more than you think you do. You read print, text, of course, but you are probably reading even more on a phone, a tablet, a computer, or other devices. Reading is now, as perhaps never before, a basic necessity. In fact, if you think that reading is something you learned once and for all in first or second grade, think again. Today, reading calls for strategic effort. As media critic Howard Rheingold sees it, literacy today involves at least 5 interlocking abilities: attention, participation, collaboration, network awareness, and critical consumption. Of these, attention to the first and foremost. In short, you need to work at paying attention to what you read. In his book, The Economics of Attention, rhetorician Richard Lanham explains, we're drowning in information. What we lack is the human attention needed to make sense of it all. When so many texts are vying for our attention, which ones do we choose? In order to decide what to read, what to pay attention to, we need to practice what Rheingold calls infotension, a word he came up with to describe a mind-machine combination of brain-powered attention skills and computer-powered information filters. Rheingold is talking primarily about reading online, but we think that infotension is important for reading of any kind of text because it calls for synthesizing and thinking rhetorically about the enormous amount of information available to us in both print and digital sources. And while some of us can multitask, fighter pilots are one example Reinhold gives of those whose jobs demand it. Most of us are not good at it and must learn to focus our attention when we read. So you just read an introduction, and what the editors and authors are trying to get you to understand is that reading rhetorically requires that you focus your attention upon the topic. Now, as you can see, we can continue to scroll down to the last paragraph of this introduction, and they say, so how do you learn to read rhetorically and to practice infotension? Some steps seem obvious, especially for high-stakes reading. Like much what you do for school, you need to find space and time in which you can really focus. So the very first step for reading rhetorically is allowing yourself time and space to read. It also means that you need to allow yourself time and space to think about what you've read. So we've practiced some of the steps so far. Read the title, read who the editors and authors are, read the preface, read the table of contents, and then as you read each section of your book, read the introduction, the conclusion, then go back and read the first and last sentence of every paragraph. What this does is it allows you to look for and capture the thesis, what they're making a claim about. It also allows you to look for their subclaims. That would be the evidence that they use to support their thesis statement, their claim, their main idea of their essay. So, now that we've reviewed these steps, let's move on to think more about what it means to read rhetorically. So if you look on page 27 of your textbook, you will see a lot of bold headings. These bold headings are in the color red. And these are the main things that the editors and authors want you to consider. A lot of these things we have already talked about. So the title will provide you with the topic, and the authors and sponsors, of course, are the authors and editors that we looked at for your textbook. We looked at the publisher, which is W.W. Norton. I've also encouraged you to skim the text, first by looking at the table of contents, and then when you go to a chapter within your textbook, you then look for how that single chapter is organized by looking for bold headings within that as well. Now, I've also encouraged you while you've been in class that you need to annotate any text that you read. And I will always ask you the same questions when you're in the classroom. What is the thesis? What are the subclaims? What evidence did they use for their subclaims? Are the sources that they use, are they reliable? Has the author or authors contributed to their ethos? Have they built a sense of trustworthiness with you as a reader? So think about these things as you're reading through the essays for our class, because I will always ask you, what is the thesis, the subclaims, and the evidence that they use for their subclaims? Along with that, I will also ask you about the tone. Is it funny? Is it serious? Do they use a little bit of humor and a little bit of seriousness? What is the emotional level within the text? And while you're reading, you could write in the margins these different things. Like if you find a thesis, you could write thesis and underline the thesis. If you find a subclaim, you could do the same thing, and so forth. So that's what they're getting ready to talk to you about here, is annotating as you read. And they tell you there are some key components that you should annotate. And these are the things that I just talked to you about, such as the thesis. But they also tell you to circle words, key terms, key words. This will help you to look for repeating words, words that are synonymous with each other, meaning that they're synonyms for each other. Because a well-written essay will use repeating words because they're trying to build cohesion. Also, by identifying key terms, if you're not familiar with any of these terms, you can look up the definitions for these, and this will help you to better understand things that you don't understand, which is the next point that the authors and editors provide for you. Is that they say to underline unclear things, to jot down questions that you might have in the margins. I frequently do this even now when I read on my own, but I definitely did this while I was a student, because when I would go to class, I could raise my hand and I could ask my professor a question about something that I did not understand within the text. Other things that you would annotate for is, do you already know about the topic? And if so, has the author represented this topic well? If they have, you could mark that within the margins. If they have not, you could mark that as well. And that would be an excellent point of discussion in class. Let's move on. They want you to consider the author and the author's stance and whether or not the author is authoritative, and to note the author's style and tone. We've already discussed this. Is it humorous? Is it dark? Is it serious? Now, authority can be built in different ways. A person can tell you their credentials. A person can build their authority by citing people who are reliable sources and well known within the field. So when I was a student and I was reading text for my classrooms, I would always write EVI for evidence. And this allowed me to get a feel for how the author was building their argument and what sources they were using. Now, within this textbook for your class, you will find that the editors and authors do quote some of the same people throughout the text, because these people are reliable within the field of rhetoric. The next thing that you should consider is, who is the intended audience for the text? Now, of course, for this textbook, it is for people who are learning about writing. But let's say that you were reading the second book assigned for this course, Superheroes and Philosophy. Who is the intended audience for that book? Some would say, well, of course, it's only for people who are interested in superheroes and comics. However, you've been assigned for it for a college class, so the audience is broadened even further. So think about the audience and what the audience knows. Highlight words that indicate what the writer or writers think the audience knows, because this is imperative. In some essays, The authors assume a certain level of knowledge on behalf of the audience. And in other essays, the writer starts from ground zero and doesn't assume that the audience knows anything. So keep these things in mind as you're reading and annotate these components within your text. The editors and authors also want you to mark any reactions that you have to the text. What do you agree and disagree with and why? And note this, write this down on the text. Pay attention to the design of the text. Do they use bold headings? Are there quotes used in the margins? Are there pictures? And why is the author using these things? And then talk back to the text itself. So you've learned about the continuum of opinion, and in regards to an argument, your idea on the argument is always the positive side, and the opposite of you is negative. And in between, you can agree and disagree. But let's say you're analyzing another person's argument, and you want to diagram this person's argument using the continuum of opinion. You would take the author's stance, what their claim is, and you would put it on the positive side. Then you would take the opposite of them and put it on the negative side. Then you would have people who agree and disagree with parts of the argument. Now, anything that does not agree with the author's stance is a counter-argument, and sometimes we call these people naysayers. When I was a student, I would literally write naysayer in the margins because I wanted to see where the author is addressing what other people are saying. A well-rounded argument will acknowledge counter-arguments. They will acknowledge naysayers, and they will provide options and other opinions for this part of the argument. So be very careful and note these. After the text has provided you with the different components that you should consider while reading rhetorically, they provide you with a sample of an annotated text. Now, I'm not going to read this entire essay here on this video because I'm sure that you've already read it on your own. But what I do want to point out is some of the things that they have highlighted in the margin. The very first comment here says thesis statement. So as I've pointed out before, and as I've stated over and over again, it's highly important for you to annotate where the thesis statement is. Also, identify the subclaims and the evidence. If we look at the second comment box, this annotated sample shows you that they've highlighted the term buying local, and they say that they're not for sure what this person means. If we go to the third comment, it says that they have identified her stance as being strongly in favor of sustainable farming and buying local. And the next comment says that they're a little bit suspicious about the evidence. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the one after that. The next comment is, here comes some evidence, looks like she's done her homework. And then the comment after that is that they're a little bit suspicious and they want to check out the evidence that she's used. Now, if the works cited page is included, you could go and check out the source. They did not provide the works cited page for this particular essay, but with most essays, those are provided. As your professor, I always do go and check your sources, and we will talk about how to properly cite your sources and build citations within Composition 1. This person has provided a graphic, and the simple annotation is, farmers markets are expensive. Most of us can't afford to shop at them. So this is the person reacting to the text. They're providing their opinion about what's being written. And then the last comment that is made, overall, I'm impressed with the research she's done. She's serious about the issue and is making a strong case. Now, for me, when I'm reading rhetorically, after I've read an essay or read a chapter within a book, there's usually this blank space that you see right here. And I will usually go and I will write what I've read in my own words because this helps me to recall what I've read for that particular chapter. This is exactly what your textbook encourages you to do on the next page. They say to summarize the main ideas. And they give you an example summary of that essay that we just read. And then they tell you to analyze the text to see if the evidence that they used is authoritative, to see if the author has offered any counter arguments. Now, one of the things that they point out is they say, is the claim qualified? What do you think that would mean? Do you think that they're questioning whether or not the argument is valid? If so, you're on the right track. And then the text says, what reasons and evidence support the claim? Is the author authoritative? Can you find the stance, and does the author offer any counter arguments? This is rhetorical reading. It means that you're engaging with the text, that you're thinking about the topic and the ideas presented to you. This will help you to think more critically and synthesize ideas. The next part of reading rhetorically involves you considering the context of the situation and whether or not the original author has also considered the context wisely. If you don't think the author has considered the audience very well, then you would have discovered some logic that has not been used wisely within the argument. The editors and authors definitely want you to consider the perspective of the writer before making any decisions about the text, and that's what the next few paragraphs encourage you to do. They also encourage you to reflect about it, which is something that we have already discussed. And they also say, respond to what you've read. And that's why when I was a student, I would write about the text that I had read and I would put it in my own words. Then they want you to read across media, and they talk about reading visual text and being very patient with reading visual text, but to look for the components of argument within those texts. And that design will be highly important when considering visual text. And they compare printed text to visual text, and they give you this advertisement here about a smart watch. And it says, a watch so smart that it can tell you the time just by looking at it. Now, I can remember a time when watches, you couldn't talk into them and you couldn't use them to track your steps and things like that. But now we have watches that are smart, meaning that they can do so much more and keep track of other things. When I'm using visual media, I tend to use like commercials and other things, and we can go over that in class. But think about the design. The print is very crisp. The colors are simple as black and white. Now, you do have some print underneath it that is quite small to read. But the designers, that name is very easily read. Then they want you to consider spoken text and reading digital text and how the genres differ, reading on and off screen. And they give you some points to consider. And all these points go back to the rhetorical situation. Making sure that your claim is articulated well, that you support your claim, that you consider your audience, that your design is cohesive to your argument, that it helps support the argument that you're constructing. And you want to be persuasive. Whatever artwork, whatever designs, whatever modality you use, make sure that you're being persuasive in your argument. Now, there are many genres that you can read. You could read lab reports. You can read books by Stephen King and other people. You can read a textbook. You can read a movie review, a newspaper. There are many genres of writing, and there are many genres of argument. And we've been discussing those throughout these video lectures and in-class lectures. Reading across the academic disciplines requires you to also engage within your text, because reading for a humanities course is not the same as reading for a science course. In a science course, you remain probably more objective. You're relying upon facts and evidence from scientific experiments. Within the humanities, you're relying upon claims and analyses that people are making about other people's claims. So be very well aware of what type of course you're in, the expectations for that discipline. But regardless of the discipline, you're always going to have evidence to prove your point. So always look for that evidence and make some real effort to discover that evidence. Reflect upon the evidence that is used. Is it used wisely? Is the evidence credible? Is it reliable? And at the end of this chapter, they want you to reflect. They say the next time you're assigned to read a text online, pay attention to your process. Take some notes on just how you read. Do you go straight through or do you stop often? Do you take notes? Do you take breaks while reading to attend to something else? What do you do if you don't understand a passage? How long can you read at a stretch and maintain full concentration? Then answer the same questions the next time you're assigned to read a printed text. What differences do you notice in the way you read each text? What conclusions can you draw about how to be a more effective reader, both on and off the screen? This is helpful advice. So we have found that when people are reading something on the internet, they tend to look for bulleted points. They tend to look for bold headings. They don't tend to read full paragraphs. And in fact, our textbooks have evolved over time to include bulleted lists. Let me find one for you to take a look at as I scroll up. Right here on page 37, you see a bulleted list. This is because the editors and authors know that we live in a time in which most people are accustomed to reading things on the internet and reading online. So they're adjusting their writing style. They're adjusting their argument to be considerate of the audience that they are trying to reach. So let's summarize what we have talked about so far today. Reading rhetorically involves you engaging with the text. And to engage with the text, you need to schedule some time to just engage with the text. And to engage with the text, you need to look at the title, look at the authors of the text. If you're reading a written text, look at the table of contents, read the introduction, read the conclusion, read the first and last sentence of every paragraph. This will help you with written text. Now, regardless of the genre of text, it's always important for you to find the claim or the thesis statement. Find the subclaims. Find the evidence. Consider the stance. Does the person who's created this argument, is their stance clear? Is the argument cohesive? Is it arranged in a logical order? Does it make sense? Do they define any key terms that they use? All these strategies will help you to read rhetorically. And finally, not only should you consider the genre, but consider what situation are you in? Are you in a humanities course or a science course? Are you attending a public speech or are you attending a PowerPoint presentation? The rhetorical situation definitely affects being able to read rhetorically. So you're not going to read full paragraphs on a PowerPoint, but you would read full paragraphs within a textbook. So again, if you have any questions, please leave those questions for me in the YouTube channel. If you're a student, you can leave questions there or you can ask the questions within class. I always enjoy speaking with you and I look forward to our next discussion. See you next time.